Hi, so sorry. Had a
No,
session ran just a little bit later than planned.
no, don't worry. I actually just emailed you saying, "Hey, I'm here if you need
Yeah,
to
I got that at the same
reschedule."
time I finished, so thank you.
Not a problem. Do you need time to, like, relax before you come? I have time if you wanna.
Oh, no, no, no. We'll be
You're
good.
good?
We'll be good.
Alright.
Yeah, no, it was just it wasn't like an emergency or a bad thing. We just just trying to finish up some things before next week.
Not a problem. Well, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come on.
Yeah, thanks for
Um,
inviting me.
I know that you specialize in anxiety disorders, OCD, um, eating disorders, and a bunch of other things. And I was hoping to chat about OCD today. Um, I was wondering if you could give like a brief definition of OCD. I know people know what it is, but your professional definition would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a bit of a misconception, so I think this is good to kind of chat about. So the kind of the clinical way I describe OCD when I'm meeting with someone for the first time, OCD is characterized by unwanted. That's like the very specific thing we want, unwanted, or maybe sometimes intrusive, either thoughts, images, or impulses. So that's the obsession that someone tries to get rid of by doing either like a compulsion or a ritual. And so usually people are trying to get rid of maybe anxiety, sometimes feelings of disgust, or just downright feeling uncomfortable by something. But that's kind of just summary unwanted thoughts, images, or impulses someone tries to get rid of by doing a compulsion or a ritual.
Got it. And what age do you think OCD starts showing?
It's a good question. So I think we can see OCD pretty young, maybe kind of the starting of it with some like rigidity around maybe like 3 to 5 years old. But it's probably not until um, like later childhood, early adolescence, where it becomes more of the intrusive thought piece, which is kind of when they're developing more of like the critical thinking. But definitely around some young kids, we see a lot of rigidity or what we call like just right feelings.
Got it. And can you explain what type of rigidity you might be seeing in these young kids? Because I taught 3 and 4-year-olds, and there were some things that we would see as educators, and we weren't sure if it was OCD
Mhm.
or something else developmentally.
Yeah. So the just right feelings or the rigidity we might see in some kids is like being very specific, maybe in something that they use or a clothing of item that they might wear. Maybe they'll be kind of rigid in the way that they do something or that someone does something for them. So, like if their parents are maybe setting up their meal, the food has to be in a certain way. They have to have a certain plate, maybe a certain fork or cup, which also kind of leads into like, is this OCD? Is maybe a autism spectrum type thing? So it is pretty difficult in younger kids to really like define that it's OCD. But kind of sometimes if we look back with some kids, when I get them when they're kind of older and we start working on things, if we kind of look back at their history, there is like this rigidity and like high anxiety, and maybe even some like reassurance seeking when they were younger.
Right, right. Yeah, that it's so interesting that when you look at them, the young kids developmentally, it is hard to tell what's autism related and what's OCD. And is
Mhm.
there kind of a correlation between the two, would you say?
I mean, it's not uncommon to be working with a kid who has OCD and also is on the spectrum. So maybe not necessarily like a correlation, but there's some comorbidity at times. But there's definitely an overlap in the way that symptoms appear.
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting. I know a lot of parents, I also babysit kids, and I know a lot of parents get very anxious when they see their kids lining up toys, and they're
Mhm.
not sure, is this autism or is this OCD? And obviously there are other factors, and some kids get misdiagnosed as autistic
Mhm.
or vice versa. So do you do the evaluations of kids to see what your um thoughts are on what they're doing developmentally?
Yeah, so if we get some younger kids, We do I also do some, like, kind of either early childhood or neuropsychological evaluations, if that's maybe some mode of concern or parents are looking for more, like, information on some younger kids. Yeah, so if there's some kind of rigidity, but we'll also look, are there maybe some social difficulties? Do they have trouble relating, like, either, like, emotional awareness and those kinds of things? Um are they very, like, hyper fixated on something, right? Those are some things where maybe we're seeing that, we're not sure where they're at, so let's do, like, a more in-depth evaluation using, like, the ADOS or the autism diagnostic, screening to kinda get more details on it. Yeah, so for some families, we'll do some more in-depth, kind of testing and evaluation to see if we can tease out the difference. But for some kids, I think we do kind of have to, just still provide treatment and do some behavioral approach, but maybe hold off on a diagnosis until they're a little older.
Got it. And what do you think are some of the most common forms of OCD in children?
So it really kind of depends on like the timeline that we're looking at. So if we're looking at the younger kids, like I said, maybe like 3, 5, maybe 7, we're seeing more of like the just right feelings. So things need to be like a certain or specific way. There may be some of the reassurance seeking. So asking, am I safe? Is this okay? Are you going to come back? Like those kinds of questions, like feeling like a need for certainty. That's kind of the big piece in OCD, like that need for certainty, whether it's like the just right feeling or as they kind of move on through the developmental range, we'll see some things like maybe somewhat what people think of like the traditional contamination fears of like germs or getting sick. But there's not really like a super common. I do intensive treatment for OCD. So like every time I see someone, it's always a different thing. So it could be related to some thoughts about hurting themselves or others. There's kind of the lesser known like scrupulosity or religious types of obsessions or sexual obsessions. It's a wide range. And I think that's part of the misconception and where some people take so long to get diagnosed because they don't know that these things are actually OCD. They think there's just something wrong with their thinking.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think also our, our thought of OCD is like tapping the window 5 times. Like
Mhm,
that's also a lot of the shows that people watch. That's how it's portrayed as opposed to all the descriptions that you just described. And I'm curious now with COVID,
mm.
how you feel that might be affecting these young kids and OCD.
Yeah, so I think COVID, has had an impact, but I don't it hasn't been in the way I think people would, like, traditionally expect it to be. Like, I've still been seeing people in the intensive treatment format throughout COVID, in person, virtually, and so, there hasn't really been necessarily an uptick in, like, contamination concerns. I think, that has maybe come out in the surface, but underneath, there's been just a lot more of this, um, I think the level of uncertainty that has happened and is still happening, has really kind of exacerbated a lot of just their general, obsessions and compulsions. So not necessarily that we're seeing a lot more people worried about contamination. The ones that do kind of we have to like reorient them to like what's appropriate and what's necessary. But it's just been like the symptoms that they have been kind of out of whack because it's just like a constant uncertainty of what's going on in the world around them.
Right. And not that there's an end in sight right now. So
Exactly. So we're still going through it.
yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's amazing that, hearing the way you're describing it is also different from the way that I was taught what OCD is. And I think that as educators, maybe we're also not fully taught on what OCD is because we know what autism is. We know about a lot of developmental variations, but that's something that we don't really get taught. And it's hard,
Mhm,
I think as a teacher to just say, oh, that kid might be on the spectrum when there's this whole other side of it now that's you got to tweak the way you're thinking
mhm.
sometimes. Do you do you find I mean, you didn't go to school for education, but do you think that there's a way for teachers to learn more about OCD in a helpful way?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's kind of one of our things as well. We do a lot, or I do a lot of like teacher kind of trainings. So we kind of go through a spectrum of like common mental health disorders and try to provide some education, and some like these are the like not to make teachers feel like they need a burden of like, all right, now I have to know all these things, but like for teachers to know like some of the common signs and symptoms of what they might see in the classroom. So we do some of that, but there's also some great resources. The IOCDF, or the International OCD Foundation, actually has like a website dedicated towards OCD in the classroom, which I don't think is it's not too involved. It's not like a whole program, but it's enough like tips and resources or informations for educators to learn a little bit more about what OCD is and what they might see, and kind of how to help families navigate that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a burden at all. I think that as an educator, it's important to know, even the basics of all
Hmm.
developmental variations because, now that science is progressing also, we're learning a lot more. And so educators who went to schools years ago,
Right.
you have to stay up to date on all of this. And
Mhm.
it's interesting that, we have state mandated tests, especially in New York, and that's not on it. And I feel like as educators, maybe, you know, it shouldn't be mandated to take a test, but to take workshops
Mhm.
on different variations just to help you, you know, do the best that you can for your students.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I think that would definitely be needed, and also it's not even just educators. I would say, like, even within the mental health field itself, like, in my training, there wasn't, like, a big class on OCD, right? Like I somehow kind of stumbled into the OCD world and I was like, this is so interesting. There's such a need. Let me kind of specialize in this. But even within my training and even within like colleagues or just other people in the mental health field, like they also don't know what OCD is. So you can't just go to like any therapist or counselor or psychologist to get OCD treatment. Like there you need to find someone who's like specialized and like knows what they're doing because otherwise they can do a lot of damage.
Right. Right. And that's the other part of it is, you can seek help, but unless you're finding the right professional help for what you're experiencing, it's unfortunately not going to do justice for you because you're not, working on the root of the problem. So yeah, I
Exactly.
mean, it's amazing that you stumbled upon this because, I was looking at the Child Mind Institute and seeing who I can get on that would be interesting. And I saw your name and I was like, oh, OCD. You deal with disorders, eating disorders. And I feel like those are more common,
Mhm.
especially anxiety. And OCD, I was like, "Oh my gosh, nobody talks about OCD." I
Mhm.
mean, it's also, not really shown on TV. It's not really shown in the real world. It's kind of
Mhm.
this undertone that no one talks about. And I've been watching the Australian Open. I don't know if
Mhm.
you watch tennis.
Not
Okay.
really,
Well,
but
so there's this famous tennis player Nadal, and they talk about how he has OCD, and I've actually never heard him talk about it. But before he plays, he always puts his hair back like 2 times, and then he
mm,
has to organize his water, and he does these common things every time he plays. And I watch him, and you see the focus, but he has to do those rituals, and
mhm.
so that would be OCD. Is that like those, tactics that he has to do before he plays? Would that be classified as OCD from where you're sitting, or you'd have to like really
I mean,
talk
I'd have
about
to
it?
know more. It would kind of depend on like, all right, is this like because I mean, again, makes it tricky. People have preferences, right? And I think even in sports, people have like their kind of like superstitions, like wearing the same football jersey, never washing it, so your team wins, right? So I think some people have like maybe superstitions or things that they do. It kind of all comes back to like, if he doesn't do this, what does he think is going to happen? Like, what's the worried outcome, right? That kind of leads more into it. But you kind of bring up a good point that, like, in the media, we kind of see like where it has to be perfect or things have to be clean or, people unfortunately do make light of OCD a lot. Like, you'll always hear someone saying, oh, I'm so OCD or, oh, that bothers my OCD. Like, no, it doesn't. Like, people with OCD often don't care about things being clean. Their room could be a complete disaster because they're worried, like, if they didn't do their compulsion right, that someone's gonna die or like their house is gonna burn down. Like, it's a lot more serious than, oh, that bugs me. Like,
Right, right. I mean, it's funny, not funny, but I'm thinking about when I was younger and people would always say, if you step on a crack, you'll break your mother's back. And now that
hmm
I'm sitting here talking to him, I'm wondering, okay, who's the first person that thought of this? And was that person not doing it because they felt that if they did step on a crack, that in turn would in fact break their mother's back? And like,
hmm
would that would be more of an OCD thing than like a superstition thing.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
if like I was working with someone and they said like, I can't step on cracks or I'm worried my mom's gonna die or something's gonna happen to her. Yeah, that's OCD. Right. If I'm just doing this, because it's a preference or it's fun, like that's different than like, just something that I feel might bring me good luck or something, that I feel might increase my chances of doing something. OCD is more of like, if I don't do this, there's a feared outcome. And even if it sounds completely illogical, like even if in my right mind, I know this isn't true, but OCD thoughts are worrying me so much, like just in case I'm going to do this to keep myself or my family or whatever else safe.
Yeah. It's amazing how the brain works. And I think that's the problem is a lot of us are saying, "Oh, if I step on the crack, I'm gonna break my mother's back," and turning it into more of a joke than
Mhm.
the reality of the person experiencing that and saying, "Oh my gosh, I have to look where I'm walking because if I step on a crack, I'm actually in fear that I have to call my mom and make sure that she's
Mhm.
okay." And I don't know, but I can only, imagine that there's also like a time, right? So, oh my gosh, I stepped on a crack. When is my
Exactly.
mom going to break her back?
Mhm.
Like it doesn't need to be instant. So that person might be living with this fear for I don't know how long.
Right. Yeah, and that's the case. Like some people, their thoughts are like instantaneous. Other people, it's like this existential thing, like to my future family, to like my future child, that I'll never get a good job, I'll never be in a relationship. And so that like makes treatment sometimes more challenging because we're having to say like, you know, yeah, you're not going to do this compulsion, and part of the treatment for OCD is living with that uncertainty, right? And so saying like, yes, maybe this will happen if you don't do your compulsion, and kind of having to like feel that and sit with those kind of yucky feelings while we kind of process it.
Right. And so you work with not little kids, but young adults, I believe. Is that
So it ranges. So
okay?
I'll see kids. I think typically for an intensive treatment, I'll see like maybe 9 years old, kind of the youngest. But in treatment, we'll do some like more behavioral work with some of those younger kids as well.
Yeah.
But if looking for more of like the critical thinking, more intrusive obsession type piece of stuff, it's usually with a little older where they can kind of engage with that cognitive.
Yeah. It's mind blowing how many different things our brain can think about and process and the amount of fears and like
Hmm.
I have anxiety and I've lived with it and kind of put on the back burner which somehow worked for me until now I'm talking to a therapist and trying to work through anxiety but these young kids, if parents aren't aware of what OCD is and how it looks in children, and teachers aren't aware, these poor
Hmm.
kids are now dealing with that. And I can't even imagine being a young child and you have a friend who's joking about stepping on a crack, and then you're the person being like, oh my
Hmm.
gosh, it's crazy that again, we've had this interpretation of OCD and it's been kind of wrong. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the fact. Our understanding of it has been wrong until now. I just I'm trying to think of how these poor kids are coping with this without knowing.
Yeah, I mean, they're thinking that there's something wrong with their brain. I'll say like for the majority of kids, and there's even like studies, and the IOCDF has a lot of information on this. I think it's maybe like 8 years or so where a kid like will go without a diagnosis, without the proper treatment of like the onset of symptoms. So 8 years, like at a minimum, there's some people even longer. who are just thinking, wow, my brain's messed up. Um, or they're thinking, well, yeah, everyone has these thoughts or everyone does these things. And it's like, no, everyone doesn't. And it's so hard um, for them having to go through that. But it's great when we finally meet them or they finally meet someone who is a specialist. And it's like, no, this is real. You've been struggling with this. Like there's a community you can get plugged into, that there's others like you, which is
Right.
really important. And like something we try to do when we get into treatment, because most people don't go diagnosed. So even though there might be someone in their neighborhood, in their school, also with OCD, they don't know about it, and so it's a very lonely disorder as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And your part of work then, do you also communicate, obviously you communicate with the parents, do you communicate with the schools that the child attends to kind of bring it all together?
Yeah, so we do a lot of consultation with schools. That's really important because, again, most educators, not of their own fault, but just don't have like all the information about OCD. So a lot of times schools are inadvertently accommodating in a negative way or giving in or feeding into compulsions. So we do work with schools to provide some education and kind of help outline, right? This is the way you can actually be helpful in this situation. And these are the ways that kind of continue to feed into OCD, which we're trying to avoid.
Right. And then for some children, is this the kind of developmental variation where they could get an IEP or a para to help them during the day while they're at
Yeah, so,
school?
yeah, so there's some kids who do have an IEP, and it provides like maybe some of those accommodations, like maybe they need more breaks or preferential seating or testing somewhere else or those kinds of things. So yeah, an OCD diagnosis can definitely get an IEP services. Um, I haven't seen too much where they necessarily need a para. But maybe if some kid, typically if they were to the level where they would need a para, they probably wouldn't be in school and they'd be in like more intensive treatment for a bit.
Okay.
But yeah, we do try to provide like services and help the school kind of navigate how to kind of properly educate a child with OCD.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's it, I'm wondering, I guess, how also in your sessions you build the confidence in the child, who's feeling all out of sorts and saying, I'm isolated in all these feelings. How do
Mhm.
you help a child cope with that and build their self confidence?
I mean, that's a really good question, and treatment for OCD is hard. Um, like with other anxiety disorders, the treatment for them is sitting with the anxiety, like facing that anxiety head on. And so no one really wants to do that. So some things that we do, first we do a lot of like normalizing and validating how they're feeling. And so it tends to be eye-opening and helpful for some kids to be like, oh wait, this isn't the first time you've heard this. Like other people have these types of really weird, freaky, intrusive thoughts. Wow, like that's mind-blowing to them. So I think that helps. And then we talk about like the treatment is evidence-based. And they'll talk about like different kind of situations that maybe kind of relate to theirs. Where I've worked with a kid who had these types of maybe obsessions and compulsions, where they were at one point and where they are now, where they're kind of thriving and kind of living with OCD in a positive way. And then I'll share, I personally don't have OCD, but I've dealt with anxiety. And so I share my own personal experiences of going through anxious situations because the treatment is pretty similar. Again, it's kind of facing that fear head on. And so we kind of talk about like, this is what I've done. I've done like exposure and response prevention therapy myself to get over my kind of fears and phobias. And that seems to kind of be helpful to them as well.
Wow. Yeah, I think that your work is amazing and beyond helpful, and I wish that it was more common and
Mhm.
known.
Yeah.
Um, well, thank you so much. This was extremely informative, and I could keep talking, but I want to let you go because it's late and you've been at work all day, I assume. But thank you so much. I'm gonna put all of the information in the show notes too.
Great.
This was incredible, and I would love for more teachers and educators to learn more about OCD. But this was amazing. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk about OCD and tell anyone I can about what it actually is.
Great. Well, I'm happy to have you back at any point to talk more.
Yeah, let me know.
All right.
Absolutely. All right.
Well,
Have a
thank
great
you so
night.
much. Bye.
Bye.